I am by all definition a Resident Evil fan. Well, that might be kind of an understatement. By that I mean I have played and beaten all of the games, and they are some of my favorite games of all time. So you can imagine my excitement when Capcom decided to do a complete remake of Resident Evil 2. Not only was that game awesome, it exceeded everyone's expectations and put Resident Evil back on the map. How could they follow up such a great remake? Well, long story short, they couldn't. You see, while they were developing the RE2 remake, Capcom was also working on a Resident Evil 3 remake, which happens to be my favorite game from the classical era of Resident Evil. So I was hyped. A remake of one of my favorite games only 1 year after the release of RE2, but then the game came out, and I loved it. All 6 hours of it. Calling the game short is an understatement, especially when considering that RE2 remake had 4 campaigns that all took about 4 to 5 hours to complete, 20 hours of gameplay cut back to 6 hours of gameplay. But that is by far not the only thing holding the RE3 remake back, and I'm about to tell you why this game failed and just how much of a disappointment it was. First off, let's talk about what this game does right. It expands upon what RE2 did well, and it adds the dodge mechanic, which is great. It works a lot better than it does in the original game. The story is awesome, and it's adapted from the original game really well. The Carlos sections are great and provide a refreshing action section compared to Jill's. All the characters are just great in general. Jill and Carlos are both voiced really, really well, and Capcom has been nailing it in this department recently, with Leon being a highlight of Resident Evil 2. The opening section, while heavily scripted, is really cool, and it's a great start to the game, and it's a great setup to Nemesis. And more on that later. Okay, that's honestly about it. So let's get to the negative side of this game. First off, I've already said it, but this game is incredibly short. I played this game right when it came out at midnight, and I finished it in one sitting. I really enjoyed it while I played it, but I was so underwhelmed when I realized that it was over. I felt no urge to replay the game because, unlike 2, there aren't any other characters to be, and there's no other campaigns. The game struggles with lack of replayability in the first place because of how linear it is. You rarely ever come back to the same place, unlike the original game where you're constantly running back and forth around Raccoon City. In the remake, Raccoon City feels small and rushed. The whole game just feels rushed. There's a large amount of cut content like the clock tower part, which is a staple of the original game. It's honestly one of the fundamental problems with this game. They didn't spend enough time on it for it to be faithful to the original. Some of the most iconic places are missing. The Umbrella Lab in particular feels so short, and while the final boss is cool, it's ungodly easy. There aren't multiple Nemesis stages in this game while in the lab. Instead, there's only one boss fight, and it's badass, but it's so obvious how to beat it. It would be cool if they had a stage 1 type boss fight that is actually challenging before the final fight like they usually do in these games. And now it's time to talk about the biggest problem in this game, Nemesis. Whereas Mr. X was awesome in Resident Evil 2, Nemesis feels like a shell of his former self, and they had so much material to work with. In the original games, Mr. X is almost non-existent in RE2, especially in Leon's campaign, but they completely overhauled him to make him one of the coolest bosses and experiences in these games. They kind of ruined Nemesis in this regard. He isn't aggressive, he doesn't follow you at all, and sometimes he just stands outside the building you're in until you decide to come out. How lame is that? All of his sections are heavily scripted, and he's really easy to avoid. The only section that isn't scripted is in the small and underwhelming Raccoon City. He isn't scary or menacing, and his boss fights are okay at best. Nothing nearly as challenging as the original game. One of my biggest problems with this game is the lack of puzzles as well. The original third game had a bunch of really, really well-designed puzzles, and all of those are really taken out except for about 3 or 4 across the entire game. It's absurd. That's one of the things that make this series so unique, but it's completely taken away in this game, and all the puzzles that are there are so easy. It's not even funny how easy they are. At the end of the day, they shouldn't have spent only 1 year on this game. If they had 1 more year in development, RE3 could have been way better than RE2. Way better, but it's rushed. The good news is that Capcom seems to have learned their lesson and they're actually spending more time on their future remakes, but it's a shame they had to ruin 3. It really is just a shadow of its original game. Thanks for watching.